let me say something about narcissism in reflection of what you said a minute ago about cluster B personality. So when we're starting to talk about narcissism and any of the what we call character disorders,
Mm-hmm.
personality disorders,
Mm-hmm.
so this is a little bit of a psychology lesson, but what
Mm.
we mean is that somebody, based on whatever, nature, nurture, how they're raised, doesn't matter, they have one singular way of looking at the world. They can't look at it through any other window than what their self perception of that world is.
Mm-hmm.
They can't get out of themselves. So we call them character disorders because they don't have any fluidity, they don't have any flexibility, they can't take in a new idea because they only have one unconscious way of looking at the world, and it's their reality, period.
So
You
they're
can't bring another.
incapable of perspectival awareness
Yes,
of holding
absolutely.
multiple perspectives.
Correct. Correct. Because they only have one, and their identity is built around one. And so, in the process of, particularly therapy, this is one of the reasons why we say, to affect, a narcissist takes long-term therapy. Um, I think there are occasions when somebody's on the narcissistic spectrum that I wouldn't argue that. But if you're at the top, if you're true narcissistic personality disorder,
Mm-hmm.
then the reason it's long-term therapy is because you're trying to get somebody out of the shell they've
Mm-hmm.
built around themselves in terms of ideas, beliefs, emotions that govern their whole way of seeing the world.
Mm-hmm.
And as a therapist, you're trying to get them to see it a little bit differently, create a
Mm-hmm.
new story, be able to move ahead. And that just takes, even if it's possible with a narcissistic personality disorder, would theoretically take years to give go through. And some of these Calvinistic pastors are narcissists. When they preach Calvinism, it doesn't make them a narcissist, but they create a narcissistic God and they don't realize what they're doing because
Mm-hmm.
they have. God is the perfect, in Calvinistic theology, is the perfect narcissist. He's
Right.
the
Right.
perfect narcissistic personality disorder to a T.
Yeah.
And if you want, I'll describe a little more about that. Um,
Yeah, I do want. I know you mentioned some of this later in your comments, but I don't know if we're gonna be able to get to them. But since you've already mentioned it, go for it.
Let me go for it, and then we'll get back to
That'd
my,
be
my
great.
comments. So when you look at, so let's take the kind of the stereotypical narcissist who's a 10 at the top of the scale. He's a narcissistic personality disorder. Let's
Mm-hmm.
take a man. Most women, if they're narcissistic, are what we call covert narcissists. You don't think they are, but they beat their husbands up verbally and other people verbally, but they
Mm-hmm.
look like saints out there in the real world.
Right.
Those are
Right.
covert narcissists. You may have experienced that in another life you had. But anyway, um,
It
the
is
overt
possible.
narcissist, yeah, the overt narcissist is one who um, exists in this conceptualization of himself, this necessary, needed conceptualization of himself as perfect, that he knows everything, that he's not wrong, and that he needs to be sort of submitted to. He's the one who's going to dictate what happens in the family. He's the one who's going to determine which kid he likes over the other. You
Mm-hmm.
see, narcissists don't love, they
Mm.
just dictate and promulgate this exposition of themselves as mighty and in control, and you better not counter them. And if you're good enough to not counter them, if you're humble enough
Mm.
to not counter them, then they get to be as powerful as they are, and you might be picked, or you
So
might
yeah,
be
so
discarded.
instead of loving, they favor those who reflect themselves back to them, something
Yes,
like that.
yes, yes. And their love is a lot of what you'll read in, I think, and you'd have to corroborate this, but a lot of what you read in theology is about the simplicity of God. It's about he's one with his act of being, Thomas Aquinas. You don't get this
Mm-hmm.
differentiated God. So in other words, his omnipotence is the same as his goodness, apparently. I mean, you don't get this
Mm-hmm.
sense that God relates at an evolved level because he's one, and uh, you can't project yourself into him. Would be the idea in that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But in this picture of God as loving, in a lot of the theology books I've read, it's one way. God can't be affected by us. He's immutable. He's impassible. He can't be, regardless of God loves the cheerful giver, regardless of a lot of scriptures that counter this, God is in the business of loving and what we have to offer. So, in that view, which I believe is in every theology book I've seen, in that view, there's no way of having a loving relationship with God because he doesn't need anything back from us. Therefore, I have, once again, no personhood. I can't bring any kind of joy to God's life because if I say I can bring joy to God's life, then that theological perspective would argue that I've changed him, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
An immutable God. So the idea that Abel's sacrifice could actually please God would be a ridiculous proposition.
It's ridiculous. And that's why much of the Bible and what it says in Calvinistic theology isn't true. It just like, that's a good example. Abel brought a better sacrifice. Well, he didn't really. God got him to somehow, but it wasn't volitional.
Right,
it wasn't from his heart. It wasn't from a relationship he had with God. So this love that God has to us is very benevolent, but that's all it is. And so there's no relational possibility with God. So with a narcissist, back to that, you don't have a relational capacity with a narcissist. All you have is adoring him and idealizing him, much as a 5-year-old idealizes his dad. And he can make decisions, whatever one he wants. He can discard people at his will. He doesn't have to justify himself. He can choose one over another. He can control everything because he's attempting to be in control of everything, and he should be honored that way. That's the sovereign God of Calvinism. At least many of the features of it are what they need. So it's a projection from early childhood onto God. And they may be hearing this and saying, oh, psychology. Well, stop and listen to me for a minute. Or don't tell me I don't understand Calvinism. I spent the last 2 years understanding it. It's not that complicated. I've got the Institutes of Christian Religion over here. I've got Wayne Grudem's volumes over here. Millard Erickson. I'm not stupid, and I'm not in the dark, but I'm curious. Well, I've got the updated version of that.
Oh, you got the update? Yeah. Oh, man. I need to get up. I need to catch up with the Joneses.
Yeah, I got more truth than you. So, just face it. So I don't want to come across as somebody who's. I lived in Calvinism for much of my adult life. I was a John MacArthur fan. Still like some of John's teaching. I'm not going to throw him out with the bathwater. I love the MacArthur family. But nevertheless, we have to realize that in Calvinist theology, they've created this sovereign God, and it parallels the narcissist in the home. Isn't that interesting? For some of you who are having trouble hearing me and believing me, just do that. Just say to yourself, isn't that interesting? And go do your own pursuit of wisdom and truth, because I'm not being dogmatic with you. I'm just saying I'm interested in this from a psychological level. I think it has merit. So now we can go back to the document.
Well, I want to connect a couple of phrases that you said. Like, we're already talking about borrowing power, and here's something that I noticed in Mark Dever's book 9 Marks. Reading through the forward in chapter 1, which we did a live stream on that yesterday, is the phrase you just said about the 5-year-old's version of his dad. He says he doesn't have to justify himself, and I see that as the other side of the coin of borrowing power. And what I found in reading when a Calvinist writes and pay close attention to how they word things, they invoke God on behalf of what they're saying to avoid having to justify themselves, epistemically or otherwise. So I no longer have to follow a rigid epistemology to demonstrate to you how I arrived at my conclusion. I can just invoke God, and then I can avoid having to justify myself. And that's I think, so if you're looking, anyway, I guess now when I'm hearing sermons from Calvinists, because I review a lot of them, and reading stuff from Calvinists, that's what I see. I see that borrowing power or using God as a means to escape having to justify what they just said or the position that they're holding. They just stamp God on it.
They don't have to explain themselves because God doesn't have to explain himself. You just have to go along with it.
And when you explain it back to them, you don't understand Calvinism.
Right. Well, that's called gaslighting.